They say land remembers. Every stone, every whisper of water has its own story etched deep into the earth, long before people come stomping through with plans and paperwork. For me, that memory lives in the creek behind my cabin, a winding, quiet stretch that runs cold and clear year-round, fed by mountain snowmelt and spring veins older than the town itself. I bought the place 17 years ago, just after I sold my shares in the energy company I helped build. Back then, I didn't want much. Just a piece of land where I could grow tomatoes, split firewood, and wake up to birdsong instead of boardroom emails. I didn't even look at neighborhoods with HOAs. I chose this parcel because it backed onto preserved land and had a private creek flowing through the lower edge. That creek, Stony Brook, is what sealed the deal for me. Not just for its beauty, but because of what I knew. You see, before I became a businessman, I was an environmental systems engineer. I knew how water moved. I knew what runoff could do to a community if mismanaged. I knew which codes mattered and which ones people ignored until it was too late. I also knew that this creek, despite its modesty, fed into a downstream watershed protected under both state and federal law. It wasn't just a backyard feature. It was a part of something bigger. My deed was ironclad. It clearly marked the watercourse as part of my property right up to the midline of the creek's flow. More importantly, the watershed map from the state confirmed it was within a Category B protected zone, meaning no dredging, filling, or alteration without extensive permits, including ecological review. That detail didn't matter much when I first moved in. No one had ever touched the creek. The land was quiet, the HOA had no jurisdiction here, and for years I lived peacefully. Things changed when Karen Holt moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago. She was exactly what the stereotype warns you about: freshly divorced, financially comfortable, and hell-bent on making everyone else's business her own. Her house was 2 lots down from mine, close enough to see the creek, but not close enough to claim it. Still, she managed to get herself elected HOA president within her first year. And from the moment she took office, I could feel her eyes on my land. It started subtly, little things. Comments like, "The way your leaves blow into the common area is something we'll have to discuss," or "Your wooden fence really ought to match the neighborhood aesthetic." I'd smile, nod, and ignore her. My parcel wasn't part of the HOA, and she knew it. I reminded her of that once, and she blinked in silence before replying with that tight smile of hers, the one that never reached her eyes. "Well, the creek is a shared resource," she said one afternoon while walking her Pomeranian past my drive. "If it flows through the community, that makes it part of the community." "No," I said not unkindly, "it makes it mine. And it's protected, so I'd recommend staying off the bank." She tilted her head like I was a confused child. "Well, we'll just have to sort it out at the board level." That was the beginning. The following months were quiet, but I noticed more foot traffic near the edge of my land. People from deeper in the neighborhood, folks I'd never seen before, were walking along the creek bed, even stepping into the shallows. I put up clear signage: private property, no trespassing. It didn't seem to matter. I didn't report anything. Not yet. I dealt with louder problems in corporate boardrooms, and besides, I believed people would come to their senses eventually. The real problem was when I saw 2 surveyors standing near the easement line, one of them holding what looked like a soil probe. When I walked out to greet them, the younger of the 2 looked nervous. The older one was curt. "We're here on behalf of the HOA," he said. "Just a preliminary site survey, drainage concerns. On my land." He tapped his clipboard. "There's a pending improvement plan that touches on stormwater mitigation." I didn't say a word. I just took out my phone, snapped a picture of their truck's license plate, and politely asked them to leave. I also informed them that the creek was part of a protected watershed, and any unauthorized disturbance would be reported to the Department of Environmental Protection. The man gave me a flat look and left. I didn't see them again for a week, but I should have known it wasn't over. The real blow came at 6:17 on a foggy Tuesday morning. I remember the exact time because I was sipping black coffee on my porch when the roar of a diesel engine shattered the quiet. I grabbed my jacket, stepped into my boots, and followed the sound down toward the lower edge of my land. That's when I saw it. A backhoe was on my creek bed. It had already carved a path into the shallow banks, scooping out loads of wet, sandy soil and dumping them into a bright orange dump truck. Two workers in reflective vests moved around like they were on a mission. One of them waved at me as if I were just another jogger passing by. I didn't yell. I didn't wave back. I turned on my phone's camera, hit record, and walked forward. Standing at the base of the slope, I called out, "Who authorized this?" The driver paused. HOA President, Karen, said it's a community drainage improvement. We're just doing what's approved. Approved by whom? Look, man, he shrugged. Talk to Karen. We're just doing a job. I looked at the disturbed earth, at the muddy gouges now clouding the once clear water. Frogs were already leaping from the shallows, escaping the vibrating metal claw, swinging overhead. That was all the proof I needed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just walked back to the house and opened my old file cabinet. Inside, I had every document I'd ever need: deed copy Watershed, designation certificates, letters from the state's environmental division. I'd kept them all. Some people frame family photos. I frame paper that stops people like Karen from thinking they can do whatever they please. It was time to make the first move. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into full-blown interference. The week after I caught the crew dredging my creek, I filed an official complaint with the state's Department of Environmental Protection. I uploaded the video I had taken that morning along with scans of the deed watershed maps and the protected status documents. I flagged it for urgent review and called in a favor from a former colleague, Mark Dinsmore, who now worked as a compliance officer in the state's Division of Watershed Resources. Mark didn't mince words. "You're not overreacting, James," he said after reviewing everything. "That's a Category B protected tributary. Dredging without review is a Class 2 environmental violation under both state and federal water codes." "What the hell is your HOA thinking?" "They're not thinking," I replied. "They're assuming. And they're assuming I won't fight back." Karen's attitude over the next few days proved exactly that. She knocked on my door 3 days after the dredging incident, dressed in a white blouse, too pristine for yard work, and holding a faux leather folder with HOA's crest stamped on it, an emblem they had designed themselves and printed on everything from letterheads to bumper stickers. I let her knock a second time before opening. "Well, hi." She smiled tightly. "I was hoping to clarify a few things after the, little misunderstanding earlier this week." "No misunderstanding," I said. "You authorized illegal activity on my land. Now let's not get dramatic." She stepped forward like she was walking into her own foyer. "The creek has always been a gray area. It's not marked clearly on some of the older plats, and the board agreed it needed to be cleared for the new water redirection system. That gray area is clearly outlined in my deed," I replied, keeping my hand on the door frame. "And even if it wasn't, that stretch of water is under state protection. You dredged a protected stream, Karen. That's not a board decision. That's a crime." Her face stiffened for a beat, just a flicker. Then she gave me that practiced, patronizing grin. "Well, I think we both know it's more complicated than that. We're just trying to improve drainage. The kids' park is getting flooded every spring. That's not my responsibility, and certainly not my land's to sacrifice." "You know," she said, folding her arms across the folder, "some neighbors have voiced concerns about how overgrown your side of the creek has gotten. It's an eyesore and a potential mosquito breeding ground. We could classify it as a nuisance under Section 14 of the HOA code if you're not careful." There it was. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Karen, my land is not governed by your HOA. My parcel was grandfathered in long before this development was even a blueprint. I'm not subject to your rules. I've reminded you of that multiple times." She gave a tight nod, then flicked open her folder. "Well, maybe we need to revisit that assumption. There are variances and clauses in your original easement grant from 1982 that might allow for a common use reinterpretation. I've had our legal counsel review it." That stopped me cold. I knew the easement she was referring to. It was ancient, a utility access easement that allowed the county to run a pipe along the north edge of the creek. But it had nothing to do with HOA governance. The fact that she dug that up and was now twisting it into justification told me one thing. She wasn't just ignorant, she was digging deep, maybe even maliciously. "I hope your lawyer is also ready for a letter from the state," I said quietly. She didn't flinch. "James, let's not make this ugly. The board is working in good faith. You could be a part of the solution." I smiled for the first time. Not warmly, not cruelly, just honestly. "I already am. I closed the door before she could speak again. Over the next few days, her campaign ramped up. HOA newsletters started including language about uncooperative parcels. I received 2 letters from the Architectural Committee, both passive-aggressive critiques about the natural debris buildup in the creek bed, which ironically had only appeared after the dredging. They accused me of creating a visual disruption to neighborhood harmony. Neighbors I'd nodded to for years started avoiding eye contact. One woman across the street walked her dog past my driveway and muttered "selfish old man" just loud enough for me to hear. Another neighbor stopped bringing her son to the property edge where he used to throw sticks in the creek. The isolation didn't bother me. The manipulation did. Karen had launched a whisper war, spreading misinformation to justify what they'd done and to frame my resistance as antagonistic. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they were busy twisting public opinion, I was quietly gathering every rope they'd need to hang themselves. I spent hours organizing a digital folder for the Environmental Protection Team. Photos of the creek before and after dredging. Time-stamped video footage. Drone shots showing sediment displacement and silt spread into the nearby tree line. I printed laminated copies of the state's protected watershed map and highlighted the tributary name Stony Brook. I also included email correspondence from a hydrologist I knew from the old days, who wrote a formal statement about the impact of even minor dredging on spawning beds downstream. I wasn't preparing a complaint. I was building a case. Karen was playing checkers. I was playing chess on a federal board. And then, just as the week was about to end, I got the call. "Mr. Warner, this is Nathan Ellis with the Division of Watershed Enforcement. We've reviewed your submission and found sufficient cause for a joint inspection. We're coordinating with federal EPA representatives. Are you available Monday morning at 8:30? I smiled. "I'll make the coffee." The Monday morning air was thick with a kind of silence I hadn't heard on my land in years. Not the peaceful hush of dawn, but the kind that sits on your chest like weight. Even the birds seemed unsure whether to sing. I stood near the edge of the creek, a mug of coffee in one hand and a folder tucked under my arm waiting. At exactly 8:26 a.m., a white Suburban with government plates turned down my gravel drive. Another vehicle followed this one, clearly marked State Watershed Enforcement on the door panel. 2 men and 1 woman stepped out, badges already in hand. Not the kind you flash for ego, but the kind you carry when someone's about to get nailed. "Mr. Warner," the taller man asked as he extended his hand. "I'm Nathan Ellis, and this is Jessica Morales with the Environmental Protection Agency. We also brought an officer from the Department of Natural Resources. We've reviewed your documentation. It's comprehensive." "That's what happens when you live near people who think HOA bylaws trump state law," I said, shaking hands. Jessica smirked. "Well, let's take a look at the crime scene." We walked down the slight slope toward the creek, where the damage was still visible. The banks were carved out in unnatural geometric gashes. The water ran cloudy and thin, and one of the marker stakes from the surveyors still poked out of the soil like a toothpick left behind after a botched meal. Nathan knelt and picked up a clump of wet sediment, rolling it between his gloved fingers. "You said this work was done without your consent." "Zero communication," I said. "They showed up before sunrise. I recorded what I could. It's all in the files. They hauled off several loads of sand." "Any idea where the sand went?" "Rumor says they used it for leveling the new HOA playground. I haven't stepped foot over there, but it's the only recent project that makes sense." Jessica made a note. "If that's the case, and the material came from a protected watershed, that's illegal transfer of protected substrate. That bumps the violation to a Class 2B offense." "You're saying this isn't just unauthorized dredging," I said slowly. "It's theft of a protected resource." "Exactly." They spent another 20 minutes documenting the site, taking photos, drone footage, collecting water and soil samples. Then Nathan turned to me. "We're going to notify the HOA formally today. They'll get a cease and desist order, and we're freezing all their public works projects pending investigation." I nodded. "I assume you'll need to speak to the HOA board." "We'd like to do it today," Jessica said. "With you present, if you're willing." I smiled into my coffee. "I'll bring a chair." The HOA's office was a converted room in their clubhouse, a building that looked like a fake rustic lodge with stone veneer and too many flags. Karen was already inside when we arrived, wearing a blue blazer, a wide forced smile, and enough perfume to qualify as a fire hazard. Two other board members sat beside her, Brad Tate and Cheryl Wu, who always voted however Karen told them to. She didn't look up when we entered, not until Nathan placed his folder on the table and opened with Ms. Holt. "We're here regarding an active environmental investigation involving your HOA. That wiped the smile clean off her face. "I'm sorry, what investigation?" Nathan remained cool. "We've received evidence of unauthorized dredging and removal of protected natural resources from a registered watershed. The work was conducted without a permit and in violation of both state and federal law." Karen blinked twice, then regained her composure, like someone pulling on a mask mid-performance. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said, flicking her eyes toward me. "We were told that the creek was a shared feature within the HOA's landscape plan. Our understanding was that minor adjustments were allowed under our community improvement initiatives." Jessica opened her binder. "Your understanding is not supported by any existing legal documents. This parcel," she pointed to a map, "is clearly outside HOA jurisdiction, owned privately by Mr. Warner. Furthermore, it lies within a Category B protected watershed. You cannot dredge it, you cannot remove materials from it, and you certainly cannot haul those materials for use in construction projects." Brad Tate shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Cheryl looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Karen tried again, voice rising in pitch. "But this has never been clarified before. Our landscape committee had no idea." "That's not an excuse," Nathan replied. "Ignorance of the law doesn't absolve liability. And we have video evidence of the activity, as well as testimonies from contractors hired under your name." Karen turned on me. "This is what this is about," she hissed. "You're going to destroy the entire community over some sand." I didn't flinch. "I didn't destroy anything, Karen. I protected what's mine. What the law protects. You just didn't expect me to know more than you." Jessica handed over a sealed envelope. "This is your official notification. As of this moment, all HOA-led land alterations are suspended. You are required to submit a full list of contractors' project scopes and financial records related to the creek excavation. Failure to comply within 10 business days will escalate this to civil and possibly criminal charges." Karen's mouth hung open like she wanted to scream, but didn't know which direction to throw it. No one on the board said a word. As we left the room, Nathan whispered to me, "You were right to call us. Most people don't bother until it's too late." "I know the type," I said. "They think silence means surrender." He smiled. In this case, it meant setup. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about a creek or some sand. It was about people who thought they were above accountability. About those who manipulate communities behind closed doors until someone finally brings sunlight in. Back home, I stood beside the creek as twilight settled in. The water, though scarred, still moved with quiet resilience. I could almost hear it whispering again. It remembered. So did I. It was barely 48 hours after the inspection when I saw the first signs of the backlash. Karen wasn't just wounded, she was cornered. And people like her don't lick their wounds in silence. They retaliate in the only way they know how, through narrative. That Thursday morning, a glossy, full-color HOA newsletter showed up in every resident's mailbox. Yes, including mine, even though I wasn't part of their association. The front cover featured a stock image of a serene neighborhood park and a bold headline across the top. HOA faces unwarranted interference, overshared waterway. I knew immediately what it was. The entire newsletter had been turned into a propaganda piece. Pages 2 and 3 contained a message from the president in which Karen detailed the HOA's commitment to preserving community beauty and claimed their recent activities were part of a long-standing waterway improvement plan aimed at protecting children from flooding and enhancing neighborhood aesthetics. She didn't name me outright, but she didn't need to. The actions of a single landowner, though outside of HOA membership, have forced regulatory agencies to overstep their authority, she wrote. We believe this is a clear case of bureaucratic overreach, fueled by personal vendettas rather than community well-being. She had the gall to frame the state inspection as an attack on her, on the neighborhood, on the children. It was classic misdirection, but it worked. Later that afternoon, as I made my way into town for groceries, I noticed the change. People who usually waved barely looked at me. The owner of the general store, Marcy, who once made it a point to ask about my tomatoes, just nodded stiffly and went back to stocking shelves. I saw two board members at the cafe whispering over lattes, casting glances that stopped abruptly when I walked past. I could feel it like a heat wave off pavement. I had been painted as the villain. Still, I didn't react. I didn't write letters or post rebuttals. I didn't show up at HOA meetings to defend myself. That's exactly what Karen wanted, a public spectacle where she could twist the story further. No, I kept quiet. Because I wasn't interested in winning the crowd. I was interested in winning the case. That afternoon, I received an email from Mark, my old colleague, from the Environmental Division. Subject: Update on enforcement. Body: Hey James, thought you'd want to know. We've issued a secondary notice to the HOA after confirming the sand from your creek was used to level the new playground. That's a Class 2B violation with potential criminal exposure. We've also referred the matter to the local district attorney's office. I'll keep you posted. I read the email twice. Then again, I knew this was big. Karen wasn't just in trouble. She was now on record with an active environmental violation tied to unauthorized material removal and misuse of protected substrate. But still, she fought. The very next day, I received a letter taped to my mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA, not officially, but it reeked of Karen. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a typed, unsigned letter. You may think you've won, but all you've done is divide the community. We've heard how you record people, how you call the state for every little thing. This isn't the kind of man people want living here. Maybe it's time you move somewhere your private creek won't be such a problem. I stood at the edge of my gravel drive, letter in hand, heart steady. Threats, veiled or otherwise, never worked on me. Not in corporate boardrooms, not in City Hall, and definitely not here. Karen had underestimated me in every way possible. She thought I was just a recluse, a man clinging to his corner of land like a dog with a bone. But I had something she didn't: discipline, patience, and a lifetime of experience dealing with people who wielded petty authority like a weapon. I made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to my attorney, a sharp woman named Marla Hayes, who had worked land rights cases for over 20 years. I explained the letter, the smear campaign, the escalating hostility. She listened without interrupting. This is getting close to harassment, she said. If they push further, we'll file a restraining order and a defamation complaint. Keep every letter, every email. And if you can prove that playground was built with stolen natural material from your creek, we'll consider civil damages. The second call was to the State Environmental Agency. I forwarded them the anonymous letter, then told them I suspected retaliation and intimidation for cooperating with the investigation. They took it seriously. The third call was to Mark. He picked up on the second ring. I got the playground confirmation, I said. And now I've got a letter encouraging me to leave town. There was a pause. Then we're going to expedite the public citation process. This isn't just an environmental issue anymore. It's becoming a public conflict. And that was the beginning of the turning tide. The very next week, the Mart local newspaper published a front-page story. HOA under state investigation for illegal creek dredging. They had obtained the EPA reports, including photos of the equipment in the water, drone footage, and quotes from unnamed agency officials. There was even a photo of the creek, my creek, with clear gouges in the bank and disturbed vegetation. The piece detailed how the HOA had bypassed permitting procedures and used the material in a community playground project without inspection or approval. Karen tried to spin it again. A statement went out from the HOA blaming incomplete records and miscommunications with contractors. But the press wasn't buying it anymore. Then came the first of the personal subpoenas. Karen, Brad, and Cheryl received certified letters requiring them to appear before an administrative hearing. Their faces turned pale. Mine didn't. And while that was happening, I stood quietly at the edge of the creek again, watching as the first rains of spring returned clarity to the muddied waters. Some damage takes years to heal. But nature, like justice, always moves slow, steady, and inevitable. The first time I held a copy of the North Carolina Clean Water Act in my hands, I was still in grad school, sitting in a dim university library that smelled like paper and ambition. I had no idea then that decades later, that same document would become my shield. After the newspaper story broke and subpoenas were issued, things started moving faster than even I expected. I received a formal invitation, more of a summons really, to attend the preliminary hearing set by the Department of Environmental Protection. It would be held at the county administrative building, open to the public, and would include testimony from both the HOA board and myself. It wasn't just about the dredging anymore. It was about the willful ignorance of environmental law, the manipulation of homeowners, and the attempted gaslighting of a legal landowner. The state wanted to make an example. I spent the 3 days before the hearing combing through everything. Not just my deed and topographical maps, not just the emails and photographs, but also the obscure paperwork, the things I had kept more out of instinct than need. Like the 2003 letter from a state biologist noting Stony Brook's unique spawning microhabitat, or the county floodplain model from 1997 that clearly labeled the watercourse as environmentally restricted, or my favorite, a signed acknowledgement from the original land developer confirming in writing that my property, including the creek, was explicitly excluded from HOA boundaries due to its protected watershed status. I organized it all into a red binder, clear sleeves, tabs, numbered exhibits. I hadn't built this case to win a petty squabble. I'd built it like a lawsuit because that's exactly what it could become. The morning of the hearing, I arrived 15 minutes early and was surprised to see how many people were already seated inside. Neighbors, reporters, and city officials filled the small chamber. Some of them looked away when they saw me walk in. Others nodded quietly. Karen arrived 6 minutes late, flanked by her attorney, a man who looked younger than the gel in his hair, and followed closely by Brad and Cheryl. She wore a navy pantsuit, heels too sharp for a courtroom, and an expression that said she still believed this could be spun in her favor. But then, the hearing officer, a grizzled woman named Diane Kelser, banged her gavel and called the session to order. And from the moment she began speaking, the room changed. This proceeding regards violations of the North Carolina Clean Water Act, the Clean Water Act, and associated county ordinances. Evidence submitted includes photographic documentation, video testimony, and material use tracing. The primary respondent is the Meadow Hills HOA, acting through its president, Ms. Karen Holt. Karen's lawyer stood. We'd like to begin by asserting that the actions taken were in good faith and based on a misunderstanding of the property boundaries. Ms. Kelser didn't blink. That misunderstanding resulted in the illegal excavation of a protected watershed and unauthorized use of its materials. Good faith does not negate consequences. Continue. They tried. Oh, they tried. The lawyer presented vague maps, claimed that the old developer's documents were ambiguous, and insisted the HOA had acted within its rights to enhance public spaces. Then it was my turn. I approached the lectern with my red binder calm as a man who'd spent his career building systems designed to survive hurricanes. My name is James Warner. I'm the legal owner of the property that includes the eastern branch of Stony Brook Creek. I am not and have never been a member of the Meadow Hills HOA. My property was explicitly excluded in the original developer agreements due to its ecological designation. I opened the binder. Exhibit A is a recorded deed showing clear boundary lines, including water rights. Exhibit B is a county topographical map from 1997 designating the stream as environmentally restricted. Exhibit C is a letter from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality confirming the creek's role in local biodiversity. I turned to look at Karen. Exhibit D is video footage of a contractor dredging my creek under the authorization of Ms. Holt, despite posted signage, verbal warnings, and zero legal jurisdiction. Exhibit E traces the exact sand removed to the new HOA playground site through truck logs and delivery confirmations. There was no sound but the turning of paper. I could see Karen shifting in her chair. Her lawyer leaned forward, whispering something quickly. Then I finished. Exhibit F is a notarized statement from the original developer confirming that my property, including the watercourse, is excluded from any and all current or future HOA jurisdiction. Ms. Kelser raised an eyebrow. Do you have a copy of that document available to the board? I handed it over. Silence followed for a long 30 seconds. Then the hearing officer turned to Karen. Ms. Holt, can you provide any documentation that contradicts this? Karen looked at her lawyer. He shrugged. No, she said quietly. We were unaware of this document. And yet you dredged the creek. Yes, but we thought. Ms. Kelser didn't let her finish. You thought wrong. And you did so without due diligence, in violation of both environmental codes and private property laws. You will cease all further activities related to that site immediately. The gavel came down once. The hearing ended shortly after, but the aftermath was just beginning. That night, news vans showed up on my road. Neighbors started sending quiet apologies through email. Even Marcy from the store left a peach pie on my front step. Karen, she didn't show her face for 3 days. When she finally did, it was with a statement to the HOA blaming confusing paperwork and a breakdown in communication between legal counsel and county mapping. But she couldn't spin it anymore. The state had already begun issuing civil penalties, fines that would stack daily until the site was restored, materials replaced, and legal restitution paid. And the best part, they had to do it all without using a single grain of my creek's sand. As I walked back down to the water that evening, red binder in hand, I felt the same peace I had the day I bought the land. The creek moved quietly again. No backhoes, no lies. Just the sound of nature reclaiming its voice. Let them whisper, let them sulk. The law had spoken louder. After the hearing, I could have walked away. I had every reason to. The state had ruled in my favor, the HOA was under financial pressure, and Karen had been publicly humiliated. But there's a difference between winning and finishing. And I've never been a man to leave things undone. The creek still bore the wounds of what they'd done. Cut banks, stripped roots, disturbed silt, choking the downstream flow. Even if the legal part was settled, the land wasn't. Not yet. And neither was I. So I picked up the phone and made a call I hadn't made in years. Dinsmore came the voice on the other end. You know you don't have to call my office line for old favors. Mark Y said you know I wouldn't call unless I needed a hand. He chuckled. If this is about restoration, I'm already 2 steps ahead of you. You found someone. I found the someone. Carla Henders, biologist. Field hard and sharp as they come. She's heading up the restoration crew for Silver Ridge Preserve. I told her about your case. She's furious and intrigued. I smiled. That's a promising combination. She'll be there Monday morning. And James. Yeah. You handled this better than most men would. HOA battles don't always end without blood, figuratively or otherwise. I'm not interested in blood, just balance. That creek's lucky to have you, he said, and we hung up. That weekend, I spent most of my time cleaning the far end of the creek myself. It wasn't much, just picking up broken stakes, removing survey flags, and gathering twisted plastic from the old dredging crew. I worked slow, methodical, the way I always have. There's something meditative about restoring damage with your own 2 hands. Late Sunday afternoon, while I was knee-deep in the water, pulling out a piece of orange tarp tangled in cattails, I heard a car pull up behind me on the gravel drive. I didn't turn right away. I'd already guessed who it was. I was hoping we could talk, Karen's voice called out. I stood wiping mud off my forearms. This isn't your property, Karen. She stepped forward anyway, wearing jeans and a gray hoodie, this time her usual polished veneer stripped away. I'm not here as HOA president, she said. I wanted to clear the air. I gave her nothing but silence. She sighed, and for a moment, I thought she might walk away. But she didn't. She stayed. You have to understand, she said quietly. I didn't mean for it to go this far. When I moved here, I wanted to help. I thought the HOA could make this place feel safe, beautiful, ordered. I finally looked at her. You thought order gave you ownership. No, she said too quickly. Well, maybe. I thought if something looked like it needed fixing, we had the right to step in. That creek looked like wilderness, untamed. I thought we were improving it. It wasn't yours to fix. I know that now. I studied her face. There was a crack in the mask now, maybe even something resembling regret. But regret without change is just manipulation dressed in humility. I'm not the only one you need to apologize to, I said. The community deserves the truth. They deserve transparency, not newsletters built on spin. She hesitated. I don't think the board would let me. Then resign. She blinked. You created this mess, I said, and then tried to paint yourself as the victim. You lied to your neighbors, violated protected land, and doubled down when you were caught. If you really want to make it right, step down. She swallowed hard. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. Every day you wait, you lose the last bit of trust anyone might still have. Karen turned without another word and left. That night, I drafted my own letter, not for the HOA. Not for Karen, but for the residents of the neighborhood. I printed 25 copies and placed them one by one into mailboxes the next morning. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was the truth. To my neighbors, you've seen headlines and heard rumors. I want to give you the facts. The creek behind my cabin is not part of the HOA. It is privately owned, and more importantly, it is part of a state-protected watershed. The recent dredging conducted by your HOA leadership was illegal, unauthorized, and harmful, not just to me, but to the environment we all share. I pursued legal action not for revenge, but for responsibility. We all have a role in preserving what makes this place special. That starts with respecting boundaries, legal, environmental, and personal. If you have questions, my door is open. James Warner. By midweek, I had a dozen emails and 3 handwritten letters thanking me. A couple of people even stopped by the property. One of them, a man named Ethan who lived 2 blocks down, brought his 12-year-old daughter to see the creek. He asked if she could help plant new native grasses once the restoration began. We want her to understand what it means to protect something that can't speak for itself, he said. That simple sentence, that small moment, meant more to me than the ruling, the citations, or even the fines the HOA was stacking by the day. It reminded me why I fought. Not for pride, not for power, but for the creek that whispered through the pines long before we arrived and would keep whispering long after we were gone. Carla Henders showed up just after sunrise on Monday, driving a mud-splattered government truck that looked more at home in a backwoods fire zone than on a suburban gravel path. She stepped out in worn hiking boots, cargo pants, and a sun-faded Cal State Environmental Sciences ball cap pulled low over a shock of gray-blonde hair. "You, James?" she asked, her voice husky, the tone not unfriendly but firm, like someone who had seen too many people do the wrong thing and too few clean up after themselves. I said, offering my hand. "Appreciate you making the trip." She shook it once, then turned her head toward the creek, eyes narrowing as if she were already scanning for damage. I read the file, watched the video, saw the soil displacement reports, she said, adjusting her pack. "But it's always different in person. Let's see what they really did." I led her down the path through the trees past the moss-covered fence post, where my property line was clearly marked. Carla said nothing as we approached the water, but her pace slowed, her body language tightening like a hunter reading tracks. Then she stopped cold. "Damn," she muttered, squatting beside the creek and pulling out a soil probe. She sank it deep into the edge of the bank and slowly drew it back up, examining the composition of sediment clinging to the metal. "You can see where they scooped here. Broke the natural root barrier, probably lost 10 years' worth of plant anchoring. And look here." She pointed to the opposite bank. "That's slump erosion. It wouldn't have happened unless they destabilized this side." I stood back, watching her move through the damaged zone, like a battlefield medic, recording everything: notes, photos, GPS tags. At one point, she even pulled out a tiny vial and dipped it into the water. "You see this color?" she asked, holding the sample up to the light. "That gray haze. It's suspended particulate from disturbed bedrock. It's choking out microinvertebrates. And that means fish fry downstream are already dead." My gut twisted. I'd suspected it. But hearing it like that from a professional, from someone who knew every consequence, made it feel personal all over again. "How bad is it?" I asked. Carla stood, brushing her hands off. "Not unrecoverable, but bad. We're going to need erosion controls, replanting, water aeration, maybe some upstream biofilter barriers to catch sediment. It's going to take 6 months, maybe more, if the rain doesn't cooperate." "Who pays for it?" She smiled grimly. "That's why I brought backup." Just then, another truck pulled up at the top of my drive. Out stepped a man in a navy windbreaker with a state seal on the sleeve and a clipboard under his arm. "James Warner," he called down. I nodded. "That's me." "Mike Capelli, State Attorney General's Environmental Enforcement Office. We're here to start processing the civil restitution claims." Carla crossed her arms. "They've got 2 options: pay for full restoration through state-approved contractors, or we file for environmental damages under Article 7. That includes fines, labor fees, and per-day violation penalties." Mike added, "And if they resist, we can freeze HOA accounts through court order. We've done it before." I was quiet for a moment. It wasn't that I didn't want justice. I just knew that some of my neighbors' people, who had nothing to do with Karen's overreach, were about to feel it too. Fines like this would roll down to the membership. Special assessments, increased dues, maybe even lawsuits among residents. "Is there a way to isolate the penalty to the board members responsible?" I asked. Mike nodded. "If we can prove they acted outside their authority, yes. That's why we need your testimony again." I agreed on the spot. The next afternoon, the officials called a formal site inspection meeting at the HOA clubhouse. Unlike the previous hearing, this one was open to residents, and they showed up in force. The room buzzed with nervous energy, half outrage, half confusion. Karen sat at the front again, flanked by her attorney, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak not once, as Carla laid out the restoration plan in clinical, brutal detail. A giant easel board displayed photos of the creek's damage. Diagrams showed where the ecosystem had been disrupted, and Mike went through the violation summary like a surgeon reading off internal injuries. This is what happens, he said flatly, when private property is treated like common ground without legal review. This is what happens when environmental protections are ignored. Then he opened the floor to questions. A man named Greg, someone I'd never spoken to before, stood up and pointed toward Karen. Why didn't you tell us about the protected status you sent out letters blaming him? He gestured toward me, but never once mentioned that the HOA was operating illegally. Karen shifted in her seat, but stayed silent. Another voice rose from the back, Clara, who lived near the playground. My son plays there every day. He's been digging in that sand. That's from a polluted creek, Carla replied calmly. The sand isn't toxic, but it was removed without any filtering or runoff mitigation. If it had been disturbed more downstream, yes, there could have been chemical buildup. It's not just illegal, it's dangerous. People started murmuring then. Not angry yelling, but the deeper sound, disbelief, giving way to realization. That's when Cheryl Wu, one of the board members, stood up and said 5 words that changed everything. I moved to dissolve the board. Karen's head snapped toward her so fast it looked like whiplash. What she hissed. I moved, Cheryl said louder, to dissolve this current HOA board effective immediately, pending community vote and legal review. Greg seconded it. Mike raised an eyebrow. This isn't technically a voting session, but if the community agrees, you can initiate a special election and force an interim suspension. That's within your bylaws. Hands went up. It wasn't unanimous, but it was overwhelming. Karen rose, halfway from her chair like she meant to speak. Then she sat back down and stared straight ahead. The board was done. As the meeting adjourned, Carla walked up beside me and exhaled. I've been to a lot of these, she said. Usually takes years to clean up. You've done more than most. I didn't mean to cause a coup, I said quietly. You didn't, she replied. They did. You just held up a mirror. Back at home, I stood at the water's edge again and watched the shadows stretch across the creek. There was damage, yes, but there was also movement, flow, life. We'd made it through the hard part. Now came the slow work, the planting, the rebuilding, the healing. Nature knows how to recover, so do people. Sometimes it just takes one act of clarity to cut through the mud. I wish I could say everything calmed down after the board dissolved, but real justice doesn't wrap itself up neatly in a bow. What followed was a slow-motion reckoning. The kind that creaks through legal channels and drips down one painful consequence at a time. It started with the fines. The state issued a formal penalty against the Meadow Hills HOA totaling $143,500. A combination of environmental violation fees, restoration costs, and a per-day accrual since the day of the dredging. The number alone was shocking, but what stunned people more was the breakdown. Each line item named the specific action. Unauthorized excavation of protected watercourse. Illegal removal of substrate material. Failure to obtain proper permits. Endangerment of aquatic habitats. Transfer of environmentally protected soil to a public area. It read like an indictment, because it was. Karen, Brad, and Cheryl received personal citations. Not criminal charges, not yet, but civil liability notices, stating they may be held financially responsible for decisions made outside their scope of authority. That's when the panic truly set in. Emails started flying between homeowners. Emergency town halls turned heated. Long-standing members who had once nodded along with everything Karen proposed now turned on one another, demanding accountability, refund, plans, resignations. The once pristine clubhouse became a war zone of folding chairs and flared tempers. And then Brad Tate cracked. He wasn't built for pressure, never had been. He showed up one night at a special committee meeting, sweaty, jittery, and carrying a stack of printed emails and invoices. I didn't know the creek was protected, he said, almost pleading. Karen told us it was part of the landscape initiative. She said the board would be covered. I just signed what she told me to sign. No one spoke for a long time. Then Clara stood up and said what everyone else was thinking. You signed off on illegal excavation. You watched someone destroy a protected habitat. And now you want us to pretend you were tricked." Brad stepped back, his face pale. "Look," he stammered, "if I testify against her will, that help the community. I have the contractor emails, the invoices. I can give you everything." And just like that, he flipped. Within days, Cheryl Wu submitted her own statement to the state attorney's office. It wasn't a confession. It was a severance, clearly distancing herself from Karen, citing coercive leadership, manipulative board practices, and a culture of fear-based compliance. The house of cards didn't fall, it disintegrated. Karen, once the commanding voice of Meadow Hills, was now radioactive. She stopped appearing in public altogether. Rumors swirled that she was lawyering up for criminal defense, that she was planning to sell her house, that she was staying with a sister in Arizona. No one knew for sure. Her blinds stayed shut. Her mailbox piled high with HOA letters, legal documents, and community flyers she would never read again. Meanwhile, the community turned inward, not in anger but in rebuilding. The interim committee proposed a full overhaul of the bylaws, starting with 3 key provisions. 1. No board member could authorize spending without full committee approval. 2. All decisions involving land modification required environmental and legal review. 3. Non-HOA properties were to be permanently and irrevocably exempt from all community-imposed initiatives. That third point, it was mine. They asked me to draft the language, and I did, carefully, clearly rooted in law. They didn't just accept it, they applauded it. That moment felt strange. For so long I had been the outsider, the landowner behind the fence, the stubborn old man with a private creek. Now I stood at the front of the room as someone they trusted to protect not just his land, but their rights too. Funny how quickly a villain becomes a reference point when the lies start crumbling. Ethan, now part of the new finance subcommittee, asked me if I'd ever consider running for a seat. I laughed. "Son, I just finished surviving your board. I'm not eager to become part of one." He grinned. "Just figured I'd ask. You're the only one who's made sense around here in months." By the end of that week, all former board members had resigned. The association had restructured into a new democratic format, with term limits, independent oversight, and a full ethics charter written with a municipal advisor. What once felt like a top-down mini-government now resembled what it should have been all along, a community, not a kingdom. And the creek, it began to change too. Carla's restoration plan had gone into effect. Volunteers arrived each Saturday morning to help replant native grasses, install erosion netting, and re-anchor the natural root systems along the banks. I taught the kids how to drive biodegradable stakes, how to handle soil gently, how to recognize the early signs of water health. I watched their eyes light up when they saw frogs return to the shallows and dragonflies skim the surface like dancers. One girl, Maya, brought a drawing of the creek and handed it to me after a long day of planting. In the corner, she'd written, "Mr. James's Creek, protected forever." I framed it. It now hangs above the fireplace, right next to my grandfather's old compass. The HOA board may have fallen apart, but something new had taken its place. Something grounded in humility, collaboration, and consequence. I still walked the creek each morning, thermos in hand boots damp with dew. But I no longer walked alone. Sometimes Ethan joined me, sometimes Clara. Sometimes even strangers who had read about the case in the paper and wanted to see the place where it happened. It wasn't about the drama anymore. It was about what survived it. The first morning the creek sounded like itself again was the morning I realized I'd finally exhaled. It was subtle, no dramatic fanfare, no revelatory lightning bolt. Just the steady burbling whisper of clean water over smoothed stones, the way it had always sounded before machines clawed at its banks and bureaucrats clawed at its purpose. I'd taken to walking the perimeter just after dawn, before the town woke, and the heat of the day swelled up from the clay. The grass was coming back, wisps of green, where there had been bare earth just months before. Watercress peeked out from the shallows again. Even the bullfrogs had returned, their deep-throated songs rumbling low through the morning hush. The restoration work was ahead of schedule. Carla and her team had done a masterful job, not just with the physical repair, but with the education. She'd insisted every planting crew be briefed on what the creek meant ecologically, legally, symbolically. For many of them, especially the kids, it was the first time they'd ever thought of a body of water as something you care for, not just look at. That was enough for me. But then something happened I hadn't expected. The state invited me to speak. It was a regional conference on watershed protection and rural landowner rights, hosted by the Department of Environmental Protection and the North Carolina Council for Sustainable Development. Someone on Carla's team had submitted a summary of the Meadow Hills case as a success model. They wanted a panelist who could speak not as an expert, but as a citizen who stood his ground. At first, I declined. I told them I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't a politician or a crusader. I was a man who liked tomato solitude and the sound of running water. But Carla called me later that night, not to persuade me, but to ask one question. Do you want people in other towns to know they can win too? That stuck with me, so I said yes. The day of the panel, I wore my cleanest flannel and drove down to Asheville with a folder under my arm. The panel moderator introduced me with a surprisingly long resume: former systems engineer, corporate director, environmental advisor, but all I said when I took the mic was, "My name is James Warner. I didn't start a fight, but I ended one." The room was quiet. Not in that distracted checking phones kind of way, but the way people listen when they know something real is coming. I owned a creek, I continued, small, unassuming. It had been undisturbed for generations, until one day a group of people decided it was theirs to modify. Not through malice, necessarily, but through entitlement. Through the belief that their vision for control was more important than someone else's right to peace. I told them about the dredging, about the false newsletters, about the smear campaigns, the fake legal claims, and the morning I watched my land chewed apart by a machine someone else had paid for. But then I told them what came next. The paper trail, the call to mark, the hearings. The day the community finally saw what had been done, not just to me, but to the environment they all shared. And then I ended with this. Laws don't work unless someone is willing to enforce them. Nature doesn't recover unless someone stands in the way of its destruction. You don't need to be loud. You don't need to be famous. You just need to own your line, your boundary, your land, your voice. The creek was mine. And I refused to let them rewrite that. When I stepped down, people stood. Not for me, I don't think. For what it meant. When I got back home that evening, there was a letter waiting in my mailbox, handwritten. No return address. I unfolded it carefully. Mr. Warner, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I've sold the house. I'm leaving the state. I'm going back to school to finish the degree I walked away from 20 years ago. I don't know if it's redemption, but I do know that for the first time in my life, I'm not trying to control anyone else's. Thank you for holding the line, even when I pushed every inch of it. Karen Holt. I read it twice. Then I folded it up and placed it in the same red binder that had once held every piece of evidence I used to hold her accountable. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it was proof people can change. Some nights I still sit by the creek with a thermos of tea and watch the stars ripple across its surface. The kids still come sometimes, usually with Ethan or Clara. They ask about the fish or the frogs or how long until the wildflowers bloom again. And I answer them, patiently, honestly, because it matters. This land was never just mine, but I was always it. They tried to take a piece of it once, not with violence, but with paperwork, peer pressure, and arrogance. And they thought I'd fold. They didn't know I'd spent a lifetime learning how to stay standing. Now, when people ask what happened here, I tell them the truth. A creek was dredged. A law was broken. A man stood still while others unraveled. And when the dust settled, the water ran clear again.